Yo, we're continuing work on the V10 E46 M3 swap. Today's episode consists of a few things. We're going to be making new engine mount brackets, as well as a new transmission mount bracket, because for this one, we got to start from absolutely nothing. Welcome back to Yav's Builds, dude. First and foremost, the engine mounts that we currently have on the engine, holding the engine up, are, in my opinion, not really acceptable. They're poly, they're not entirely what I want, they're self-adjustable, which I don't really like the idea of, so what I got here are a few LS engine mounts. The thought process behind these is actually quite simple. I can always buy an LS engine mount. If I ever need to replace my engine mounts down the line, down the road, I will easily achieve that by getting an LS engine mount, because I can buy an LS engine mount absolutely anywhere. They're fairly reliable, and they are also pretty cheap, all things considered. So I bought myself some LS engine mounts. We're going to be building engine mount brackets based off of these instead of the ones that are currently on there. Secondly, here we have a mock-up of a transmission mount bracket and the entire assembly for it. These mounts right here are actually stock E46 M3 mounts. I purchased these because they have a very simple design, unlike an E92. These are quite simple and also relatively cheap, and this is a stock piece that attaches to the E92 M3 transmission. This is the piece that I'm going to be replacing with this piece right here, because as you can see, the E92 M3 6-speed transmission is held up to the chassis by this bracket. It is attached by 4 bolts right there, but if you put this right up over here, right to where it bolts up, it's sticking out a little bit too far past the original E46 M3 mounting positions right there. Those 2 holes right there, that is where the original transmission brace is hooked up to in the E46. There's a big gap here. Sure, I can still implement this and make brackets that extend down to the chassis, but we figured with Daniel, it would be easier if we make our own plate out of steel instead of aluminum this time. Do something along these lines right here. So that plate is gonna bolt up to right about there, right? It's gonna bolt up, transmission mounts right there. And because the chassis is actually uneven, this piece right here on the driver's side, it hangs down lower than this piece right here on the passenger side. So we kind of have to work around with this. People that did do these swaps already, they have went about this in a few different ways, and I think this would be the easiest and also still very reliable. So that's what we're gonna be doing with Daniel, and dude, let's just get on with it. We made a mount, but I messed up. We made the mount wrong. As you can see here on the mock-up, the edges on the very bottom of that first plate, initial plate, right, that goes all the way to the transmission, they are flat and 90 degrees. This mount that we made, I followed the shape of this one for some reason, the original one, and made the edges just like that. That is incorrect. We're gonna be welding on a flat piece on the very bottom like this, and if the corners are tapered off like that, and not flat, then we're gonna have a slight problem. So, round 2, here we go. I made a new mount. As you can see, this one, the bottom flat piece, is completely flat. And we will easily weld up a plate to the bottom of it, just like that, so that the engine mounts can actually screw into that. And just like that, this plate is bolted onto the actual transmission itself. Of course, I'll clean up the edges on it, make it all nice and pretty, and these bolts bolt up and go through everything pretty nicely. For the engine mount plates, I did the exact same thing. I put the engine mount itself right about here, measured it all out. I'm gonna make it square and simple. These, I'm gonna probably cut them out to spec to how the original engine mount shape and design is, but we will see. For now, I'm just gonna cut out these squares. Something like that, right? All right, let's get to welding. Well, the transmission main bracket is starting to look quite lovely, in my opinion. The idea here is that once the transmission is up as far as it needs to be, the two bushings are going to be sitting right about there. I already drilled the holes in them for the little stub on the bushing itself. The bushing is going to come out right down in here, and then we're going to have another plate going into the actual frame. Since this side of the frame is actually sitting higher than this side, we're going to have to make some sort of, not necessarily a bracket, but like a spacer almost. Drill a hole right through it and mount it right straight through there. So let's get going with it, dude. Okay, we're backtracking. As it happens so often with builds like this, we're backtracking again. Look, just by looking at this engine mount bracket right here and this, who knows what engine mount this is, the LS mounts are simply not going to fit. You can't really tell on camera, but this bracket right here that's welded onto the subframe, it's under an angle. It's not perfectly straight. And when the engine mount is going to be sitting like this, first of all, the hole that they already pre-made, it doesn't match up with the stud on this engine mount, right? So I can't even fit this engine mount in. Also, it's way more bulkier than expected. I saw a lot of guys using these LS mounts, but their setup was a little bit differently. And this is, I guess, the downside of buying a pre-made subframe. You just kind of have to work around it, or, you know, at that point, just make something ourselves. But I already have a subframe, so my plan is to work around this. It's definitely a little bit challenging because we're running into issues that we weren't really expecting to run into, because the people who made the subframe for the guy I bought it from, they had a different vision in mind, I'm assuming, because, you know, every build is slightly different from another one. In essence, our thinking now is I'm not going to be using these LS ones, but rather I bought stock E46 M3 mounts. This bottom stud right here fits perfectly through this hole. Also, they're a little bit shorter. Once this engine mount actually sits on that plate, they're a little bit shorter, which gives us a little bit more room to work with, but also that means the engine is going to sit just ever so slightly a little bit lower. But also that depends on where we mount this bracket right here, right? So this plate that we made, we're going to have to weld on another plate right here, which now that I'm looking at it, this top plate is going to have to be under a slight angle, something like this, because as you can tell, this engine mount is not flat up top. It's not sitting like this, but rather like this. It's under an angle because of this plate right here. So once this is going to be seated nicely and flush, also it fits, it doesn't touch any frame rails, that's amazing. It's going to be sitting lower, and we just need to consider all these factors into the process of making the engine mount bracket. Another thing, we don't want the engine to sit too low because the steering rack is going to have even more of a hard time fitting into this. Also, depending on what I do and what I decide with the header situation, most likely I'm going to be going custom. I don't want the engine to sit way too low either, because that's going to make more complications with the headers. So if we keep this height of the engine relatively close to what it is now, that would be pretty good. It gives us just enough room to work with the steering rack. I already have some ideas in mind to make the steering shaft fit into the steering rack without causing any sort of touching with the headers or anything, but stock headers are simply not going to fit. This engine is sitting way far back into the firewall, which is great because that just gives me more center of gravity and, you know, all sorts of benefits like that. The way the engine sits is pretty good in my opinion. I'm gonna have to reinforce the subframe just a little bit more, mess around with the steering rack and steering column, but I think the right plan is to mess with the engine mounts first, then make the transmission mounts, and then work around everything else, because I'm definitely supposed to keep in mind of everything, right? But I can't work with everything at the same time. I have to work around certain things, and then I have to pull the engine out a million times and see how that fits with everything else. So it's a long process, stay with me. So what I'm doing is I took a level, put it from shock tower to shock tower to see how well the actual chassis is sitting down in it. And as you can see, it is pretty damn straight. I like it. Then I took a smaller level, put it from fuel rail to fuel rail, just to kind of get an idea of how well the engine is sitting compared to the body, and it's pretty good. The left side is a little bit too high, but we can adjust that. Next up, engine mount. The OEM E46 M3 engine mount is now seated. It's nice. I cut out a little hole there. That way this nub right here on the bottom of the mount actually fits. And now we have an engine mount that is seated nice and flush. Next up, we gotta make the actual engine mounts themselves. This engine mount I left for now, that way I can adjust entirely how much I want the engine to be seated and which direction to be leaned on. I have adjusted the engine on this hoist to sit exactly where I want it to sit. The transmission is seated exactly where I want it to be, so now let's make the engine mounts. she's sitting on her new engine mounts, dude. All under her own weight. No chains, no nothing, ain't that right? Dude, yo, check out Daniel, man. Check out Daniel's page for real. Dude's been killing it, dude. He's been killing it. He has an LS, he's swapping into his Z. Check it out. Dude, that thing was a complete rust bucket.
Yeah.
It ain't anymore. Check it out, dude. I'm telling you, you won't regret it. You can see the level of the engine is pretty spot on as well. Right on the dead center. The spacing between the head and the beam itself on each side is about the same. Dude, gnarly. Very gnarly. Oh, you're thinking of going like that?
No, not at all. I'm just being funny.
That's not funny.
Shut up.
So you see the thought process for this is that because we're using an angled one, it adds more rigidity and more sturdiness. So here we have it, ladies and gentlemen. The transmission mount brace is ready and done. Of course, it's not powder coated yet or anything, but it is completely done. I'll clean up all of this in a little bit, but for now, the transmission and the engine are completely seated and on their own weight on their new mounts. You might not be able to really tell in video, but this side, the driver's side of the chassis, the frame is actually hanging down a little bit lower than this side of the chassis. So this was a little bit of a challenge, as well as this part of the chassis right here. You can't really tell, but there's a little bit of an engraving and it kind of goes up right about here. It goes up, so we had to make a little spacer. Because of this little spacer right here, I had to get a longer bolt for it to clear through and go all the way up into the chassis. I am very happy with how this turned out. Daniel did an absolutely killer job. This brace, this mount right here, it's actually fairly slim if you look at it. It doesn't protrude, it doesn't go past the actual frame rails right here. I'm still left with a whole bunch of room for when the headers are going to be on. We're going to route the headers from somewhere, you know, from where they're at, all the way through to right here, and then we'll make an X pipe somewhere around here. And dude, yeah, there's plenty of room for that. There's definitely plenty of room for that, and I couldn't be happier, man. This engine is all balanced, the transmission is balanced and sitting straight. You can see that the shifter lever right here is right dead in the center. You can see that. This is turning out real good. And as you can see, it's also very cool that we were able to implement the stock E46 M3 mount bushings right here. It's pretty sweet. Makes it a whole lot easier down the road. Don't have to look for anything specific. Just E46 M3 transmission mount bushings. What's really cool about this entire setup is that, to be honest, it's not all that heavy. Maybe 5 pounds, maybe a tiny bit more. I mean, granted, yes, compared to the stock setup, it is definitely a lot heavier, and yes, the E92 M3 transmission is bigger and heavier than the stock E46 one, but compromises for a race car. It's fine. I'm going to transfer some weight to the back of the car, transfer it over from the front to the back, and it's going to be fine. It's going to be leveled out, and it's going to be good. Yes, it's heavier, but is it more sturdy and more durable? 100%. The spacer I was talking about right there, which was supposed to be made, we didn't have a choice because these two holes right here are the transmission bracket mounting holes. And as you can see, it goes up and it curves up right about here. So yeah, man, I'm beyond stoked on how this all turned out. It definitely exceeded my expectations. Daniel absolutely killed it. And again, if you're interested in more work like this, Daniel is gonna be having a whole lot of similar work going on soon. He's swapping an LS into a Datsun. Dude, that's gonna be crazy. It's gonna be a monster. On that note, I think that's gonna be a good ending to this video. In the next video, stay tuned because we're gonna be making my custom shifter because it's definitely too long. That's all I'm gonna say. It's too long. We're gonna be making the headers fit. We're gonna make the steering rack officially fit and sit down where it's supposed to be. So yeah, man, stay tuned. Let's stay in touch. And if you're trying to cop some of this Hot Boy merch, dude, link is gonna be in the description. Peace.